So the three spheres of NCD: radiating salt and light in a changing church landscape. Many of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Adam Johnstone, the director of NCD Australia and one of the directors of NCD Internationally. And I look forward to bringing to you some fresh insights today about recent research related to NCD and looking back over quite a long period of time now and looking forward to the next decade of NCD related ministry. Just in terms of interaction through our time today, there'll be a couple of spots for various types of interaction, but generally speaking, right through the webinar, I'd be very happy for you to put in any comments or feedback or thoughts in the chat window as we go. Probably hold off on putting any questions in there because I'll lose them in the chat transcript, and my multi-skilling is ordinary at best. So we will have a question time at the end. So if you want to just keep your questions to the side, but otherwise, love for you to use the chat window to add comments and also interact and provide thoughts along the way. Okay, so before we move into the webinar, just to get a feel for who we have in the room today, I'd like to just invite you, based on this map here, I believe we mostly have people from Australia and New Zealand. We have some from other parts of the world. But if you would like to just grab the, sorry, I'm just doing some admin here. If you would like to just grab the pencil here and grab your favorite color and mark somewhere on the map here where you're joining us from today. If you're from overseas, I know we have friends from Qatar, so you can just draw an arrow, if you like, in the direction of your given country, if not on the map. Lovely, that's great. So we have people up the east coast of Australia, west coast of Australia, people in NZ, that's terrific. Wonderful. We've got a great cross section. And also, if you don't mind, just writing in the chat window your background, perhaps denominational background or your role, just that we all might get a feel for the kind of people who are in the meeting today. So just scribble that in the chat window and we can have a quick read of that. Lovely. Lovely to have you, Ian, from the UK. Terrific. Lovely. It is truly one of my favorite parts about NCD ministry is the diversity of backgrounds within the Christian church, that we are able to come together around common principles and have really rigorous discussions about church development from the widest imaginable background. So terrific that we've got lots of different backgrounds represented here today. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I'll just close up here. All right, so next year marks the 20th anniversary of NCD in this part of the world. And yes, some of you are feeling old right now. It's quite an extraordinary amount of time, and that's an awful lot of churches, thousands of churches that have been surveyed across this country and across the NZ and generally through Southeast Asia. So it's quite a significant point in time, and we're beginning to think of how we might celebrate that in various different ways. I'm not very good at celebrating, so I hope to improve a little bit with that and find good ways to celebrate this very, very significant milestone in the history of this ministry. At a personal level, it's also quite interesting because the same year, next year, marks the 20th wedding anniversary for my wife and I. And you will note in this photo that the same year that NCD came to this corner of the world, without any connection whatsoever, we just happened to have 3 colour bridesmaids, which is more than just a tad mystical in the overall scheme of things. But God has a wonderful sense of humour as he prepares us for what we might engage in the future. So anyway, it's a point in time for me of a lot of reflection, looking forward. Yes, sorry, I should point out that is me in the middle with hair. Many of you have never ever seen me with any such appendages on the top of my head. So at this point in time is a very significant time of reflection and thinking about all that has gone past, but also looking ahead to the next phase of time. For me, there's a very strong feeling, and I say it quite often, that from an NCD perspective, we're just getting started, and that is not just some saying, that's a very practical reality in terms of addressing all that can be addressed through the principles of NCD, reaching many churches who have never, to this point, begun to really consider the dynamics of natural church development, be it celebrating their maximum factors or addressing their minimum factors. So there really is so much more to come. But moving into the content of the webinar today, I can move to a question that I consider for myself, and that is, am I happy with the progress of churches through the NCD process? If I look across my about 18 years of NCD involvement and look across the 20 years in this corner of the world, am I happy with the progress of churches through NCD? Well, I have two answers to that question, and the first, and they are answers that are very different to each other. The first is a categoric yes, absolutely. It is stunning to consider over time the churches we've had opportunity to work with that in many cases have come from some truly dreadful starting points, some very tragic and painful starting points. The very first church I personally worked with had an inspiring worship result that was below 0. So that was my baptism into the NCD world. And over time, many more churches that we've engaged with that have had very challenging starting points, and yet we've seen progress from every imaginable minimum factor from all different kinds of churches, and even for churches that don't have such challenging starting points. We've seen churches move from a level of relative complacency perhaps, or in a state of plateau, moving forward to significant levels of growth and even multiplication of the church. And beyond this, even after all these years, the principles of NCD stand rock solid. They continue to be tested. We continue to research it. There are plenty of voices that endeavor to explore them from different angles, but the principles remain incredibly solid. So from that perspective, the progress we see, I can say, yes, it's exciting that there is little, there are a few peers in the context of church development, so NCD to a very large extent is very much at the forefront of what is happening in the renewal of churches. Now you may guess my other answer to this question of am I happy with the progress of churches through the NCD process? And my second answer is absolutely not. It's a disaster. It is terrible. And trust me, these two answers for me cause me a lot of tension, but they are both absolutely true. So I can say, yes, I'm very happy with the progress, but at another level, it's simply not good enough. We need to make much better progress. If we took even some of the best progress we see in churches around the world and we normalize that, if we said, let's make that the level of progress that all churches were seeing, well, I'd be still quite concerned that we'd be a long way shy of revival in any part of the world. So there is so much more for us to try to explore and understand about this. So as we do in NCD, these questions go a little bit beyond simply having interesting reflections, but move naturally into the data and to say, what can we identify? What can we discover about the progress being made by churches? Well, I dug into the database a little while back to look simply at what's the average progress between NCD surveys. We had looked at things like what's the progress after 3 surveys or 4 surveys or so over the longer term. But to simply break it down to progress between first and second and third and fourth surveys, we simply had never really looked at that terribly much. And so this is what met me when I dug into the database. Basically, between first and second surveys, this is worldwide, we see an average of 3.57 points progress. That's terrific. That's great. They're just starting out and they see that progress. But immediately, as you can see, the thing that struck me and was most disturbing to see is that there's a very clear drop-off in the rate of progress after that first cycle, and the second cycle, and then onto the third, fourth survey cycles. So this is very troubling, and this is the kind of thing, though, that immediately means there's something for us to discover here, something for us to explore and find out. On that basis, we will be able to find means to see that progress accelerate considerably. So if we just consider for a moment reasons to expect better progress. Why could we expect progress to be better than this? Because we're not going to completely turn the world upside down at that rate, very clearly not. So are there reasons to expect better progress than this, or to be surprised that the progress is not higher? Well, there are a number of them I can think of. Simply, there is a lot further that these churches can go. It's not like they've reached the point of super athlete. They're not kind of all Usain Bolts and going to have difficulty taking another 0.1 off their 100-meter time. On average, these churches are only at about 56 points in NCD score terms. So that's an awfully long way still to go in terms of further health. So they're clearly not topping out in health. So they could make further progress, but as we see, they're not. The average church has made progress and has momentum. Well, this is a very good reason to expect further progress. We have to think that they already have some momentum on average. They've already made some progress. Any non-believers in the possibility for the church to be renewed would, as we see many times, are starting to get on board. They're starting to say, hey, there might be something in this. It might be possible to see our church move forward. So they have momentum on average. So why would we necessarily see it drop off in the same way? They understand the results and process better over time. So when you start the process, it's all new. You don't understand the terms. You're not sure how to read the results. There's lots of things you have to come to terms with. And yet, once you do that, you would expect that the capacity to understand the results, the capacity to engage with the results, to move forward in different ways would be better developed the further you go. But we're not seeing that same effect. All right, and then finally, they have an increasing idea of what works and what doesn't work. So they're starting to get a handle on the general idea of the sorts of steps that will bring about some progress and the sorts of things that may not be quite so helpful. So the practicalities of trying to improve the health of the church are improving. And yet we see this kind of chart we see here. So there are plenty of reasons to expect it could, the progress would not only be maintained, but maybe even accelerate further. So we have to dig further and try to understand what's going on here. So let's look at the other side, some possible reasons for declining progress. Why might things be slowing down? Okay, well, a spontaneous one that may come to mind is, okay, they don't like NCD anymore. Well, it's not really an answer to this problem. Certainly there's plenty of people that don't really like their NCD results when they get their minimum factor and they don't like it. I ask them, which minimum factor would you prefer to have? And generally they would prefer to have no minimum factor. So eventually most are willing to accept that the minimum factor they see is probably what they need to address. But the point is that those who don't like it anymore are not in this sample. They don't continue with the process. They may take a single survey and just simply reject the results at that point. So these are churches that are choosing to move forward that we're seeing in this particular chart. What about, getting distracted by their maximum factor or the latest thing? Well, this is certainly a valid possibility for a reason for decline. Distraction is a huge challenge in the NCD process, because what we're saying is, by all means, celebrate your maximum factor, but at the same time, we're suggesting, and the research is suggesting, that you need to focus on your minimum factor for the next 12 months. Well, the minimum factor is a very area that they like the least, so it's not a super attractive message to present. So the distraction factor to move back to our maximum factor and a greater focus there, or move on to the latest thing, that's certainly a potential issue in the mix here. But it's still really not satisfactory to answer what we're seeing here completely. Further to that, we could say, for some people, progress is not fast enough. Our decline has not turned to revival yet. And this is certainly valid. There is a microwave mentality in many cases whereby even if our church has been plateaued or in decline for 5 or 10 years, somehow by taking the survey and starting to do some work, we expect to see it turn around very rapidly. And sometimes there are very rapid turnarounds, but other times it will take a little longer. So this can be a reason for people to back off. But at the same time, we're still looking at churches in this graph who have decided to continue with the process and to repeat the survey. So it's still not really answering the question. And then finally, could it be that some of these churches are hitting deeper cultural sticking points after picking some low-hanging fruit? Now, this is some phraseology that's often used in NCD coaching circles to try to explain some of the dynamics that begin to happen in the early stages. Perhaps a church addresses some more obvious issues and then they continue forward. And then they start to really rub up against challenges that have been buried a bit deeper in the life of the church, a little bit more problematic in facing that. So of all the possibilities, this is the one that seems to have the greatest likelihood of being linked to this kind of decline within the progress. And so on that basis, this then led me to start exploring this a little bit further, because it's one thing to say that's what's happening, but it's not good enough for us to sit there and just accept that. We still have to find a way through. NCD is all about removing barriers. How are we going to remove the barriers that relate to the deeper cultural sticking points? So we are seeing genuine Romans 12 metamorphic change of people's lives and the culture within the life of the church to a whole new level. So that's really what we need to deal with. And clearly, to this point, we've made some inroads. And my yes answer is yes, I'm very encouraged by the progress, but my no answer is this is simply not good enough. This is we have to go to a whole nother place in this context. Okay, so with all that sort of background in place there, just to take you on the path of both research and reflection, discussions with Christian and discussion with many other different coaches and people over time to start to get a handle on this so we can really launch forward into the next chapter of NCD with a whole new level of momentum. I've zoomed out to think about, in really broad terms, what are we trying to do when we're developing the health of the local church and trying to increase its fruitfulness? Well, in a very large measure, we are trying to follow the prayer of Jesus, that your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are wanting to see the kingdom rule of God become the normal rule woven into the fabric of life within our local churches, and that the John 15, increasing fruitfulness, will be a natural byproduct of all of that as we remove the barriers to see the kingdom come over the time. Now, this also connects us, though, to the idea of the radiating nature of the kingdom rule of God, or in NCD terms, the principles of the kingdom of God, and how they radiate out from the center of the local church and ideally move out to have a wider transforming effect. This can lead us then to thinking about the classic metaphors of salt on the one hand and the radiating effect of salt. You put some salt into any kind of food and the saltiness radiates out through the food. And this is a very clear metaphor given to us by Jesus to help us understand the nature of the way, the non-militant way that Jesus' kingdom permeates the world and through the church and through the lives of people. And of course, the other clear metaphor is that of light, which moves out and illuminates the dark places. So it goes from our local church through the lives of our people, outside of the church, into the dark alleys, into the dark corners, into all the places where people are stuck in darkness. And rather than trying to stomp out the darkness, you simply turn on the light. And so the saltiness and the brightness of our churches is essentially what we're trying to turn up when we're developing the health of the church, so that the radiating effect from right in at the inner core with the senior pastor and the leaders, and permeate out through the congregation, out towards the fringe, out beyond the doors, and right out into the surrounding community. That's what we're endeavoring to do. And so we have this radiating effect that we are wanting to amplify and magnify through the process of developing the health of our church. Now, if we take this a little bit further, we have the familiar pot plant type diagram, the spiral diagram representing the NCD process, whereby the spiral moves around all by itself. Growth is represented by the spiral, and that's limited when we hit the minimum factor, so in this case, gift-based ministry. Now, every one of these 8 areas has a certain radiating effect from the leadership through the congregation and right out into the outer parts of society. And these are principles that are important not only to the local church, but well beyond, to the ends of the earth. And what we can understand by the relative strength of each of these areas is that it relates to how much community transformation we could expect from that. So if we, in this example, have a church where passionate spirituality is very high. Now, within the church itself, that's really positive. So that's a great thing to experience, spiritual passion, a huge sense that God is alive and active in people's day-to-day life. But beyond that, of course, those people live out in the world. Those people who have passionate spirituality woven into the fabric of their being move about in society, and they spread this passionate spirituality that is part of the heart of God. And in this case, that's the greatest thing that they radiate. That moves out. That's some of the salt and light that specifically moves out into the surrounding community. If we take a look at most of the other areas, I've marked it here to indicate that each of the different quality characteristics are going to have a different community transforming effect depending on how well they're developed. So loving relationships and need-oriented evangelism, they're quite well developed. So they will also have quite a strong transforming effect. However, other areas like empowering leadership, inspiring worship, they're not so well developed. So those people who have those principles embodied within them as they go about in society, they're not going to be having as much salt and light effect and transforming the lives of other people through those means. And of course, it then points us also towards the minimum factor here of gift-based ministry in this example. And so the notion of gift activation, the idea of helping people to discover what is their purpose in life, is a very, very significant thing. And it's not just some inner church concern whereby we hope to find people's gifts so we can give them a job or put them on the roster. Instead, we want to extend that much further out so that we have people who are characterized by gift activation wherever they go and helping people find their purpose for living. For about 2.5 years, my wife and I and family, we lived in the Sutherland Shire in Sydney. And at that time, I believe, that shire had the sad reputation as being the area with the highest rate of young male suicide in the world at that time, which was a deeply troubling thing. I mean, these are people who are not understanding their purpose in life. They are not being activated accordance with how God has made them. They see no purpose. They run out of hope. And the logical conclusion in their minds is that they would take their own lives. So these things we talk about in NCD terms start as sort of inner church discussion points, but the ramifications of each of these areas are enormous as we develop these principles in the lives of our people, and those people live their lives out in the world around us. And so there's a different level of community transformation related to each of these zones. So this got me thinking further and further about, well, how do we take the principles to be not just something about reshaping the innards of the local church, but really stretching it much further beyond, so that we see this kind of radical, complete, thorough community transformation. This has led to an understanding of 3 spheres within NCD. Now, I say straight away that what I'm talking about here and what I'll continue to talk about is not really anything to do with a prescriptive approach. This is not, oh, here's a bunch of ideas that NCD has dreamt up and here's the way you should go about developing your church. It's not prescriptive in that sense. It's what I'll be talking about today is descriptive. It's simply, this is how it works. This is how any church anywhere, whether engaged in NCD or not, needs to progressively develop itself if it is truly going to have a revival bringing, community transforming effect ultimately. So one way or another, each of us has to find a way to move through these three spheres, whether it be with the tools and assistance of the NCD process or by whatever other means. We have to find a way through, because this is a representation of simply how things are. And so progressively, what we're looking at is how do we spiral outwards further and further to develop that all by itself growth. So eventually, the all by itself releasing of potential moves from within the church through the people right out into society. Okay, so with that, let's start to take a little bit of a look at each of these spheres. So the first one we call the church sphere. And there's nothing particularly special about this, and anyone with any experience with NCD will be very familiar with all of this. It's simply the initial realm in which salt and light become saltier and brighter as the leadership team begins to look at and address their NCD survey results. So this is really just NCD survey process 101. Many of you are familiar with the key influencer diagram on the screen here. If not, you can find it in the strategy guide associated with the NCD survey results. But in general summary, the idea is that there are some people in the church who are more influential than others, and those people have a much greater influence on the NCD survey results, or put another way, they have much greater influence on the salt and light, the saltiness and the brightness within the life of the church than other people do. So they have to be the people who begin to take the lead and to take a look at their own lives, their habits, their approach to leadership, everything they do through the lens of the survey results, to say, where am I in these results and what can I begin to do differently so that my influence, which is already there and I can't turn it off, will flow all by itself and radiate outwards through the congregation. Now, if we continue past the congregation on the left of the screen, we would then move out into the rest of society. So this is where this radiating effect begins. Now, many of you have heard this presented over time, so again, nothing particularly new, but we can say in the NCD process, the increased radiation of salt and light out to the world begins with key influencers recognizing their larger influence over the maximum and minimum factors of church life, and then doing something to improve the nature of their influence. So this is the start of this radiating effect, and pretty much all the progress we see so far around the NCD world is largely based on this dynamic here. So it clearly works, and it's a valid part, and it's an essential starting point. It's just simply not far enough, and that's where we'll head to in the subsequent stages. But just to take a pause so you get a moment reprieve from my groaning voice, I just want to take a quick poll for a second. And the overall question is, what is the most common first survey minimum factor that you have encountered? What I'll do is I'll just turn the poll on the screen here. And so I just invite you to tick one of the answers based on that question, and we'll see what we've got. Okay, I can see the results progressively coming in. I'll just give it a couple more seconds for people to respond. Fun because I can see the results appearing on the screen, changing the chart. Okay, I'll present that result now. So it appears we've got every minimum factor represented in the room, I believe. I trust you can see that on your screen. Looks like we've got every minimum factor represented, but certainly the one with the lion's share, it would seem, is loving relationships at this time. So that'll certainly be interesting for you to think about as a specific area as we go through the rest of this spheres concept. All right, very interesting. So second place, passionate spirituality, loving relationships, the most prominent there. All right, very good. So moving along then. So faced with their first NCD results, a question that came to my mind as an opportunity to look into the database was, well, what do we know about the approach taken by most pastors and leadership teams? So if we're going to try to answer this question of what's happening with the progress over time and why is it rolling off, is there anything we can learn about the way that leaders are approaching the results in that first round? So what I looked at, we'd never looked at this before, but the benefit of having lots of data is you can cut it up in all sorts of ways. I had a look at and pulled out of the whole global database personal items and corporate items from the church survey. So what do we mean by this? So basically corporate organizational items, for example, our leaders actively seek to remove barriers that limit my ministry. Our leaders are spiritual examples to me. I understand clearly how the different parts of our church work together, etc. The idea here is these are items where the responsibility doesn't sit on purely an individual, but instead sits at the collective level, the organizational level, the leadership level, if you like. And so then contrasting that with the progress made in personal items from the survey. For example, I know my gifts, which at the end of the day, standing before God will be your responsibility to be able to speak into. Times of prayer and inspiring experience for me. I prepare myself to participate in the worship service. So these kind of items where personal responsibility is the key and personal growth is the most critical part. So by looking at the progress made between first and second survey and comparing it in those two sets of items, I'm simply interested to see if anything might emerge. Well, I wasn't quite prepared for what emerged from the results, and I present them to you now. Basically, leadership teams on average make 85% more progress on the corporate organizational aspects of their NCD results than the personal. Now, given the fact that we even present NCD with the key influencer principle in mind and the personal responsibility of leaders and the personal dimensions of the NCD process, NCD has always had a strong focus on the personal change levels. All of these sorts of things are written into the tools, lots of different places. This is quite a startling result at first sight. Even if it was 25% higher, it would be statistically significant, but 85% more progress on the corporate organizational aspects is just through the roof, even in areas like passionate spirituality, where you would think there's inherently a significant personal dimension to that. You can tell just by the name of it. In that case, it was even higher, 124% more progress on the corporate side, organizational side of passionate spirituality than on the personal side. So this was clearly a bell ringer of a discovery that then requires some significant analysis and exploration beyond that. But rather than immediately saying it should be any different, as I said earlier, this is a descriptive view we're taking in terms of the steer. So how do people do it anyway? And how can we transform that energy if we know that most leaders are going to take a certain approach no matter what, and therefore we simply need to embrace that and steer it appropriately down the track. So first of all, we should simply celebrate this. If you look at on the screen, the top three items that make the highest progress between first and second surveys are things like our leaders actively seek to remove barriers that limit my ministry. Fantastic. I know the goals we're working towards as a church. I know what value my work is in the overall work of the church. These are almost like summary statements of NCD itself, removal of barriers, creating an environment in which growth can take place, those sorts of things. So this is fabulously encouraging to see that these kinds of areas are the ones that make the greatest progress when leadership teams move into it. And these are the people responding to this, very positively affirming their leaders for the actions that have been taken to organizationally create a better environment where good things can happen. So we're trying to set up a better nurturing garden where great things can take place. Now, an interesting point as an aside to this is that you might be inclined to think, well, whatever the most common minimum factors are, you might expect to see the highest progressing items come from the most common minimum factors because people are focusing there. And yet these three items and a few others that follow them are actually from some of the less frequent minimum factors. So even without focusing on those areas, these are the sorts of areas that people are spontaneously improving by the way they're approaching the development. These are the things that are moving up. So first of all, as I say, we should just celebrate this and say this is terrific, because that is, this is the kingdom coming on earth in a tiny little way, a few percent way. It's appearing there and should be celebrated. But then to ask the question, why is this difference so large? And on further reflection, and I look forward to further input over time, and perhaps many of you have ideas around this, but it seems the largest reason realistically for this huge difference is that in leadership and pastoral circles, the level of responsibility for organizational things, for legal compliance, for making sure the meetings are run and organized, the services are put in place. There are so many requirements, and in fact they're increasing if we consider child protection requirements and many different things. The compliance type issues organizationally for church leaders are extremely high. Then if we contrast that and we say, well, let's look at the kind of areas in church life you're most likely to be held accountable for. So if leaders are not taking care of the budget and organizing the services and doing various things like that, they're likely to get wrapped. I mean, many of you are pastors. You're likely to get wrapped over the knuckles for that. That's going to be called out, and people are going to get upset about that. But if you contrast that with the likelihood of someone saying, so pastor, in the last 3 months, who have you personally and intimately discipled on a regular basis to help them to grow? The likelihood of being asked or held accountable for that is much, much lower. And so people will generally do what they are most required to do or most likely to be held accountable for doing. And so it's perhaps not quite so surprising that we end up with this bias. But clearly it points us towards a pretty good reason why we may see this roll off in progress, because once you make progress in your first cycle, the natural behavior is to say, however we did that, we should do more of the same, and we'll continue to make progress. But from what we can see here, clearly the personal items are going to be getting left behind. And if you keep trying to organize the church more and more into better health, you're going to eventually start hitting the wall. So when we talk about these deeper cultural sticking points, I believe a major part we're dealing with here is more the transition from organizational change to personal transformation and ultimately. So this then leads us to our second sphere that, again, simply must be engaged with if we are hoping to see community transformation eventually. And we call this one the character sphere. It's essentially where we are seeking to transform the character of the people in the life of the church into a greater likeness of Christ. If we explore this area simply with a series of questions and ask, what is the church? Well, the church is people. Sure, there's other bits and pieces, but if you take a sampling of churches around the whole world, there's many churches, in fact, the majority, that don't have specific buildings or finances or budgets or whatever else. So if you boil it down, the church is people. And then the secondary question, what is the health of the church? Well, it's the health in the heads, hands, and hearts of those people, and really not much more than that. And then the third question, all right, how do we improve the health of the church? We improve the health in the heads, hands, hearts of the people. That's basically how it goes. And again, this statement is on the back of one of the NCD books that's been out for a decade and a half. So we're comfortable that we've been attempting to present this message, but what's clearly come through for us in this is that the emphasis and the need to shift into the second sphere is far greater than any of us really anticipated in the interest of seeing greater progress. So in summary, the hard reality is that you cannot grow your church if you do not grow your people. You can take the great steps of creating a wonderful environment in which growth can take place, a bit like building a terrific school with all sorts of facilities, but unless you actually start to teach the people and grow the people and transform the people, the students in the school, then it's a very limited exercise. So as far as the NCD process is concerned, in this sphere, the transition is, for the character sphere, it's about approaching the church's minimum factor as a discipleship minimum factor. And so what do we mean by that? Well, if we consider the quality characteristics, which many of you, or perhaps all of you know, the 8 quality characteristics that relate to the church level and the evaluation of overall health of the local church. Well, side by side with those, what we can do is we can put dimensions of discipleship that directly relate to all of these 8 areas. And what we're talking about is, in very specific terms, what is a characteristic or a dimension of discipleship that has to become apparent, has to emerge in the life of a person if they're genuinely becoming like Christ? So whereas empowering leadership applies at the church level, empowerment is something that must become a characteristic of every disciple. A person who empowers other people passes on God's power to other people to lift them up in life. Gift-based ministry in the church context, gift activation, which I referred to before, helping people discover their unique purpose in life, as well as making sure that you're activating your own gifts. This is part of what it is to be a disciple. Passionate spirituality, passion for whatever it is that you're engaging within in life, and the renewal that comes from a life of passion as well, drinking from God and being filled up to face the challenges, taking the original term for passion from Passio, not just the enthusiasm, but the grit and willingness to face challenges and the ability to do so. Effective structures, effectiveness in life, which is largely linked to stewardship. How well do I use what God has given me? This is absolutely a dimension of discipleship. Inspiring worship service. Inspiration in its twofold sense. The idea of inspiring, that is breathing in, learning how to breathe in, but also to inspire, that is to help others to breathe in or to breathe into others in the same way. This is a critical part of discipleship. Holistic small groups, community, developing people who, if they sit down at a table with another group of people for any amount of time, that group of people will be closer to each other when that person leaves than when they got there. And the ability to form and shape community, wherever it is, with 2 people, 3 people, 6 people, however many people, that is a trait of being Christ-like. Need-oriented evangelism, need relief, the capacity to go places and see the need wherever you are, and then to look for ways to relieve those needs, no matter what those needs happen to be. And then loving relationships, of course, love. I could say love, and yes, we all believe love's important, but to get to the grittier level of it and to say love is just not some passive thing that if I am able to love you, I'll love you. It's the question of, do I have the form of love that you need right now? Do you need to be loved in a gentle way? Do I have that within me? If I haven't grown that, I can't love you right now because I haven't grown in the fruit of the Spirit adequately to do so. So this is the kind of transition in each of these levels that we need to make to understand that to develop our people in those areas is ultimately going to develop the quality characteristics within our local church. Just as an aside, some of you probably have the book, The All By Itself Pathway, or a version of that. These 8 factors on the side at the personal level are mentioned in there. You might like to have a look at that sometime. Now, if I just make this practical to try to illustrate where we get stuck between the kind of corporate organizational side and the personal side. If we take a look at this picture here, now this is a denomination I worked with recently, and it's a corporate profile of about 25 churches, and it's a split profile. So it splits on the age group of over 40s and under 40s. So what you'll notice here is there's some large gaps in the area of passionate spirituality and inspiring worship. So in many, if not most, local church circles, if by some means we identify there's some tension in worship between the generations, then we go down a path of trying to figure out what style of music or how we're going to please everybody, how we're going to adjust the nature of the service and put certain things in it, take certain things out. The the point is that nearly all of those discussions are organizationally oriented discussions, trying to fix the problem organizationally. And I've been in so many of those discussions in the last 18 years, it's almost driven me around the bend. But that's the usual approach to take to try to bring that corrective. But as soon as you introduce the character sphere, you start asking the questions, well, do we have worshippers turning up at the worship service? Have we trained our people to know what it is to be a worshipper? Because it's not going to make too much difference how we organize it. It's still not really going to work if people are not arriving, having read Malachi 1 and seeing that God says, please shut the temple door. Don't even come in if you've brought in a three-legged, one-eared lamb. So instead to bring people to that place. And what's remarkable is I've worked with many churches where the organizational part of worship appears to be quite ordinary. It's a bit all over the place, and even if it's organized well enough, there's nothing spectacular about it. And yet their worship results are fantastic. And the noteworthy thing is clearly these people have been taught to be worshipers. So when they turn up, you could hit a stick against a brick and people will sing to it and they'll be engaged in worship because they understand the personal responsibility to bring their best to worship. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with those discussions and dramas and debates and conflicts related to worship, but it's a very practical application of this need to move and look at the character dimension that the NCD results are pointing us towards. Passionate spirituality is another example. Simply looking at the idea of saying, well, if we want to improve our passionate spirituality, what often happens is we will just try to amp up our traditional spiritual style to a higher level and hope everyone catches on. But in the background, there's a strong likelihood that there's many people who have slightly different spiritual styles, who, far from being empowered by such an approach, are going to have their spiritual life almost dampened out. It's going to be sort of put out rather than brought into flame. And so by moving to that space and not just trying to organize passionate spirituality, more prayer chains, more prayer nights, various things like that, but to take a personal approach and say, how do we grow this person to be a person filled with passion? And what does that mean in terms of the unique way they connect with God? So they're the sort of practical things that fly out of there. Now you will notice in this profile, the one area that they all agree on is loving relationships. And if you average up all the lines, in fact, it was the minimum factor for this whole group of churches. And so if I just round out then on looking at the topic of love or loving relationships, we have to be prepared to move to a place that's not just about organizing more social events or trying to get people connecting with each other or arranging the chairs differently so they can see each other better, but to go to the deeper levels and ask ourselves, in Galatians, was Paul just trying to write nice poetry, or was he actually trying to write something really, really practical when he talked about the fruit of the Spirit? Unfortunately, over many years, I've seen a lot of evidence to suggest that the church has accepted a lot of the, in some parts, secular, but I think that's too unfair on the secular realm in certain dimensions, but the idea that you'll take a personality test and that's just how you are, and everyone else therefore can read my results and now they know how they have to respond to me because this is just how I am. Now that's so far from the Christian gospel, the Romans 12 metamorphic kind of picture, utter transformation picture of Christianity. It's just not funny. And so we have people that may speak about, oh, I'm just a melancholic kind of person. We have these on leadership teams and elders groups. I'm just a bit more melancholic. That's the way I am. Well, I like to call that out and say, so you've got a joy problem. Let's take a biblical approach perhaps. Or someone says, oh, I'm just a bit driven. I'm always involved in lots of stuff and there's things flying. That's the way that I roll. And we say, okay, so you've got a self-control problem. Maybe you could grow in that because that would make life easier for everyone else who has to survive around you. And so at a given point, we have to be willing to say, surely this biblical teaching is meant in some practical way. Surely there's a lot of practicality to Jesus saying, by this, they will know you're my disciples, by your love for one another, and that it will have practical manifestations and need to be grown. So if we're talking about, in the context of love, fruit of the Spirit, Well, is fruit measurable? Yes, usually. Can fruit be grown? Yes. Is it of the Spirit? Yes. Okay, so the whole of NCD is about removing barriers so that the Spirit, who is not going to just barge in, is able to do, ultimately what God wants to see happen. So we definitely need to push in much more and get very serious with the continuous discussion about discipleship and say, well, we have to find ways of doing that. And in the context of an NCD survey, one of the great benefits is that we can narrow it down rather than trying to swallow the whole load of discipleship, which is going to be too overwhelming alongside all the compliance and organizational things. But to say, here we have a result for our church that says rather than trying to disciple in 8 areas, we've got one area to focus on. And if we can just set aside a little bit of focused time to very deliberately disciple in that context, we could see some spectacular progress take place. And certainly the churches that we've seen that have moved more so into this character sphere, you see very significant progress in those areas. Right, I'm going to give you another little break now from my voice, and I'll give my voice a little break as well. I'd like to ask my wife to just speak to you for a few minutes about what this character sphere means in our own world and very much at a personal level. So welcome, Melinda.
Hello there. Hi. So I was the bride at the beginning of the webinar. You saw the picture there. So I had no idea that when I chose red, green, and blue material, the symbolism that would involve. All I knew is that I liked the fabric, but I look back at that now and I'm completely blown away at how God can weave together your desires and his at the same time without violating your free will, because I look back and think that is so amazing, and it brings me great joy because the 3-color paradigm has become an integral part of my life, of my marriage, and in raising our 4 children. And the practical tools, the workbooks that come alongside the principles that we discovered when we ourselves have taken church surveys, the tools that have come out of that have been so life-giving. And so we've used those in a number of contexts when it comes to small groups or one-on-one discipleship, in marriage counseling, and more recently in the homeschooling of our kids. We started that a few years ago. And we have many, many, many practical 3-color discussions, and we retake the tests, we chat about our results, how we've grown and where we need to grow. So 5 months ago, in the last 5 months, 3 boys have entered our world who have wanted to court our daughters, and that turns your world upside down and changes a lot of the dynamics in your family. But it has been so much fun, and it has been so incredibly reassuring that there are principles, there are foundations that never change, and that these principles are coming to life in our children's world and in their connection to the opposite sex. And we could never have imagined that when we had our 3-color wedding, what that would mean for our children and potentially their future spouses. So we used to always have this joke that Adam would come to the front door when a boy came calling for one of our daughters. He'd come to the front door not with a shotgun, but with 3-color surveys. And what's kind of funny is our daughters have taken it upon themselves to issue these surveys to these boys that show interest. They are keenly interested in finding out, okay, so what are your spiritual styles? And how well developed are you in love? Or where are you not well developed in love? What should I expect from you? And this is what you can expect from me. I need to grow in this area, and I'm great at giving this fruit of the Spirit. So we have many lively discussions, and it's brought me as a mother and such joy when I have a 16-year-old boy standing in front of me in my kitchen, and he simply asks, Melinda, how do you define love? And I think, oh my gosh, that's such a magnificent opportunity. And I said to him, well, you know, Geordie gave you the book because he already had the 3 Colors of Love book. He'd already done the test. And then from there, we just talk about, well, what does this look like in your life with your family? What does that look like when you interact with us? So these great opportunities. And another young boy interested in one of our daughters, after discussions about 3-color kind of topics, simply asks our youngest daughter, who's a couple of years younger than himself, he says, can you help me to grow? Oh, wow, her heart just melted. She thought, yes, and I actually have some practical tools that can help us to grow. It's not just airy-fairy. This is real nitty-gritty everyday life stuff. We have our 3 girls. We also have a boy, but he's too young at this stage. But our 3 girls are involved in dance teaching. And so they take this 3-color paradigm, the tools that they had used in terms of leadership and how well they can empower other people. When they go and serve at their dance school, they're questioning, how can I better empower the students that are under my authority? So this is real stuff for us, and it's all of life. So we're surrounded by my parents, Adam's parents, my brother and his wife and their 2 young boys. We have multiple generations and friends who live around this area, and all of us, to varying degrees, are acquainted with this 3-color paradigm and the practical implications of the tools that are available to actually help us grow as human beings individually, but also as this little community that we have here. So yeah, that's a part of my story, and I hope you have picked up that I'm very passionate about this. Enjoy the rest of the webinar.
So now you have a little bit of a sense of how utterly bizarre our household is, and trust me, if you ever come for dinner to our house, you won't necessarily be issued with surveys before you can enter. Exceptions on that. Yeah, so as you can see, this stuff is very real for us, and for me personally, it's near impossible to try to engage in the NCD paradigm without it having an extremely personal connection with that, and to see the effect in personal life. And Melinda mentioned about the boys entering the household. And for me, it's mind-boggling to be sitting with these boys interested in my daughters, and to be having incredibly deep discussions about the fruit of the Spirit and what it means and what the absence of it means. And I never quite imagined that at this point in life it would be quite so enjoyable. I had some fear of it, to be completely honest. But never mind. That's where all that sits. So we're in the context of the character sphere here, and this personal transformation layer within the overall local church development process. And we can go back to this similar diagram from before, where we were looking at this from a local church perspective and the radiating salt and light moving out towards community transformation. But we can put individual believers in the center of this in this case, and say, I am personally developed well in certain areas and not so well in other areas, and that has an effect in every relationship, every connection with every other person, wherever I go, all week long, wherever I am. And so for us as in church leadership to be able to turn up that salt and light in the lives of our people, that multiplying, radiating effect is enormous, and clearly goes a long way beyond the organizational adjustments that we may do within the context of the early parts of the NCD process. So in terms of timing, what I would suggest is that, sorry, I skipped a slide. struggling with technology. So if not before, you'll probably need to look at expanding into the character sphere after your second survey. And this is important in terms of timing, because for many people coming to NCD, the feeling is, my goodness, there's a church survey and there's 8 quality characteristics and there's 3 colors and there's this and there's that. There's all sorts of things everywhere. But the beauty is, if we simply go with the natural tendency of leadership groups anyway, that is that in the first cycle, more than likely, they're going to approach the results in a very organizational way and say, that's terrific, that's fine. All we want is some momentum and some progress. So let's move into it that way, see how that goes. And then, but at the same time, let them know that at a given point, on the basis of the sphere's picture, you will need to move into this character sphere somewhere down the track. They might choose to move into it earlier or a bit later, but at least the engagement with all the principles is spread out over a period of time and becomes far more digestible. They are dealing with the concepts that are all necessary if you're going to ultimately see community transformation take place. They're dealing with those concepts at a point in time where it's most needed, where they have some space to be able to do so. So that's another benefit of having this staged process, because in early days of NCD, we really just said the process is you do a church survey, and then 12 months later you repeat the process and do the same thing, and then 12 months later you repeat it and do the same thing. Whereas with the spheres, we're able to very clearly see some self-determined nuances that have to be put in place just because of the way that local churches tend to respond anyway. So we can shape the process and make it much clearer about what it looks like over the longer term. Now, in practical terms, if you're working with churches, one of the simplest ways to increase engagement in this character sphere, it's mentioned actually in the strategy guide of the NCD result guides, but just this idea of making cycle starters available to more people, putting them in the hands of small group leaders, inviting the average Joe in church life to take a look at the basic results of the church to see we have maybe passionate spirituality is a bit lower. Okay, on these cycle starters, what could I do? How could I put an oar in the water next to the boat and help to row it along a bit further? And what you're doing in that very simple step is you are doing some very focused, need-oriented discipleship. You are providing for people exactly the kind of thing that's most beneficial for the church collectively and helping them to grow along the way. So that's a simple thing that can be done immediately to take people deeper into the principles, into this character sphere. But of course, we have the 3-color discipleship tools, and these are, of course, over a long period of time and continuing to be developed, purpose-built for exactly this reason. It might be of interest to some of you that NCD didn't actually begin originally with the church survey. Before it came to the English-speaking language, it was a discipleship tool system. That was all there were discipleship tools, and then eventually the decision was made we should do the international research and look at developing a church survey. So the DNA is actually in the discipleship realm, and so these tools are then purpose-built for that. We can look at what is the minimum factor of the church, and then we can look at the tool that relates to that. But then when the individual makes use of that particular tool, it is able to point them even more specifically to the growth areas within their own life, or the things to be celebrated or embraced within their own life. So the whole idea is to take this clearly challenging topic of discipleship and make it much more practical, make it sensible and sustainable so that people will be willing to do it and will be able to follow through with it. In addition to this, you can check out the 3-Color World website sometime, where the e-tests are available, and there's instructions for making use of them across a whole congregation of people to make it very easy to enter some names and email addresses, press some buttons, and very quickly have a whole lot of people discovering their gifts, for example, quite rapidly to get that sort of process underway. But we've only come through these first two spheres, and so we have this final sphere to look at, because even with those steps in place, we're still not ultimately going to see the broadest level of transformation. So with that, we then move into what we call the community sphere, and it is the sort of third and final level of this radiating power. To understand it, the simplest way is to ask the question, how much time does the average church member spend in church organized activities? Everyone would have a different, if we consider the fact that there's roughly 100 waking hours in each week, some might say, oh, okay, maybe 5 hours they'd spend in church organized activities, maybe 6, 7, 8. Well, in the interests of being sober-minded and not trying to force a point, I will just round it off and say, let's say 10%, so 10 hours a week. Now, clearly that's a very active church member, but let's say that they're involved for 10 hours out of 100 hours in church organized activities. So that obviously means that they're spending 90% of their waking hours in other activities or activities that are not church organized activities. This is important because for all the salt and light that applies in the leadership realm of the life of the church and what we're trying to do in transforming people, most of that is only available or active in a relatively small time frame. So you have to have proximity for light and for salt to have an effect. You have to be near what you're trying to affect. And so there's a remarkably small amount of time in terms of church-related activities that in which the leaders can have that salt and light effect with various people. And so the theory is that as we apply ourselves in that 10% of the time, there is a kind of wave that flows out into the rest of life. We hope that people, become more spiritual, more loving, they grow, they've celebrated things, they've worshipped together, and then they go out and they have this effect. And so we could say the good health of local church, and sadly the bad, flows out and influences the rest of the week. But the main aim is we try to improve the health of what we're doing so that it will flow out and have this broader effect. But of course, as you can well imagine, the other wave that flows in the opposite direction is much, much larger. And so we can say the good and the bad of the rest of life also flows in and influences local church life. So when you've got two waves of those sorts of sizes, you've got to hope that that big wave is full of goodness and happiness and lots of good things going on there. Celebrations, and someone got engaged and someone got a promotion, and there's good things happening in life that flow back into your local church environment. But of course, all the other disasters and tragedies and sin and whatever else is happening is also going to be part of that mix. So this then means we go back to the thought of the progress made over time between church surveys. It's understandable why it potentially becomes quite difficult. And I hope some of you take heart in looking at this diagram. If you're trying to develop your own local church or a group of local churches, this is to some extent what you're up against. Is there is a somewhat unpredictable wave that causes cross currents for whatever you're trying to do. So it could be 5 steps forward and 4 steps back, or even 5 steps back in some instances. But again, this isn't so because I say it's so. This is just simply how it is. This is the dynamics of dealing with the amount of time that people are in each particular space. And so we have to be able to contend with that. Now, with that picture in mind, and the understanding that we clearly need to be mindful of that larger space of time and look at ways to engage people in that time with the principles of life in all its fullness, the principles of NCD. I'll take a little sidestep for a moment to address the topic of, is a healthy church a missional church? If we're talking about all of life, Christianity and church life, it naturally moves us towards some of the modern day discussion around missional church and different versions of church and types of church. Now, I must say from the outset, we from NCD have not been strongly engaged in these discussions over time, and we realize now it's actually been quite remiss of us. The main reason we haven't been particularly engaged, and it may sound a little bit funny, is that we haven't necessarily found a lot that has been said that didn't already emerge in the research of NCD. So the idea of things being organic and developing in certain ways was kind of there. So the tendency was to not necessarily speak into it if there wasn't much to speak into. But the problem with that, though, is that there are a range of things that have been talked about and are talked about in that space. that are causing a lot of confusion in some instances and causing degrees of uncertainty amongst churches, wondering, do we need to redefine ourselves? Do we need to restructure ourselves? Do we need to become one of those kind of groovy sort of churches of some kind in order to be effective? Well, I'd like to just quickly speak into some of these dimensions, and in the context of assertions that are presented and reasons to question those assertions in this modern discussion. Well, one of those assertions is churches must become more outward focused. Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a great idea and sounds like, of course, that is what should happen. But in reality, it's simply not true. The reality is that at least half of the churches in the entire NCD database need to become more inward focused for a period of time in order to be more fruitful. Precisely the issue is if people come near that fellowship, the love and the internal dynamics are the issue that stops them making further progress on their journey. For some churches, they are very active and engaged outside of their fellowship and wanting to reach people for Christ. The problem is that they haven't done enough housekeeping in growing their people so as to be giving off a sweet aroma to those who would come near the church. So it's simply an incorrect notion, and it is true, certainly, of many churches. They should take a larger focus in that direction, but for many, for a season, not forever, but for a season, they have to focus internally because the people come in and simply go out the back door because they haven't dealt with the inner growth dynamics of the Christian life. Okay, another assertion, we must move away from an attractional approach to church. Now, in all of these points, I know there is something that the people are trying to communicate behind it, a valid concern, and I don't question the motivations. The problem in every instance is that it's unhelpful, foggy language that needs to be dealt with in some way because it simply causes confusion in those trying to engage in the discussion. And the simple fact is that healthy church community is extremely attractive. So if someone says we must move away from an attractional approach to church, I say, okay, well, I've been to some pretty unhealthy churches. I can give you all sorts of ideas about how to make a really unattractive church if that's the goal. But the simple point is it's a bit of a non-issue. Where God is, it will be attractive. Jesus was very attractive to people. You don't set out to be attractive, but where the genuine principles and life of the kingdom are in place, it will be attractive and there will be people who will be drawn to that. So again, I understand there are concerns behind it, but the language is not necessarily helpful. Another one, we must move away from an institutional model of church. Again, very problematic. Some people will start what might be a coffee shop church. Well, you just instituted the fact that you have church at the time that you have coffee. So to institute something is to put something in place that is deemed an important aspect of whatever it is that you're doing. So to have institutions or to institute things in and of itself is neither good nor bad. The only question can be that of fruitfulness. Is it actually effective, whatever that thing happens to be? So as I say, every model of church institutes things. So it's not helpful language at the same time. And then finally, we must take an incarnational approach to ministry. So the idea of being incarnated in the world, woven into the world. And the simple challenge with this assertion is that, as we see by this particular diagram here, the vast majority of time is already spent in the world. So most people in any local church, even the most active members, spend by far the most amount of time in amongst other people. Now, some might be on staff, and it might be the case that they're more involved for longer periods of time in church organized activities, but the vast majority of people are already out and about in the world. So some of these notions are simply not helpful in trying to understand what we need to do to move the church ahead. So what we can say after 20 years of NCD around the world is that amongst the many discussions taking place, the central issue that must remain our primary focus is the quality of salt and light within the lives of Christians collectively and individually. Every single one of these concerns on the left-hand side, the concern behind it is comprehensively dealt with by addressing the health of the local church and the health and the heads, hands, hearts of the people. The rest of it flows all by itself. The transforming effect flows because the people in that church are living their life in that 90% and being salt and light within the world. But more specifically, to look at this community sphere a little bit further, we can say that expanding on the church and character spheres, the community sphere is about empowering church members and those they do life with to understand and live out the principles of life in all its fullness wherever they go. So it's grabbing hold of that 90% and saying, clearly our major focus of ministry and support and development of people, and Ephesians 4, raising people up for works of service, has to focus on the space where they spend most of their time. Otherwise, we can't hope to have the maximum transforming effect within society. And so I'm excited to say that we've been doing work for some number of years on a means of helping this to happen in a very, very practical way. Let me just give you a few slides to step you through this. This little guy here, I call him Mo, and it could be any person on planet Earth, literally any person on planet Earth, but let's say it's a person on the fringe of your local church, or maybe even someone that never comes near your local church, but is connected with someone within your local church. Now that person does life with a whole bunch of other people. And with those people, there are some some people that they perhaps work with, some they might be in a sporting team with, and some they might even go to church with. But then there's also some people that they just like to hang out with, that are not necessarily in any organized thing with them. So this is what their life looks like. Now, the special group of that within that person's life is their oikos. It is their sphere of influence. These are the people who they most need and who most need them. Oikos being, as most of you would know, an ancient Greek term which means household, and our modern understanding more like extended household. So the people that are most significant to your day-to-day life, where your influence sits, and people who influence you. And the fascinating thing about the oikos, or this sphere of influence, it's the one social unit in the whole of life that you can't join and can't leave. You are always part of it because it is centered on you. You are at the center point of your own oikos. You can attend a local church, you can leave a local church, you can join a sporting team, you can leave, you can work for one company and leave that and work for another company. But your oikos is the most consistent unit of your entire life. And so what we've been working towards, and very pleased to say we're in the very final stages of testing, ready to make this available around the world, is a My Oikos survey. And basically, you can think of this in terms of an NCD survey for the oikos of every person on the planet, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. The principles are laid out such that they can identify to what extent is life in all its fullness happening in my life. What do the relationships look like? The service, the confidence. What is the little pond I'm swimming in, what does it look like, and how can I move forward, and how can I grow within that? Now, the exciting thing with this is the principles involved in looking at someone's oikos are exactly the same principles as looking when we look at the local church. And so on that basis, it gives a fantastic opportunity for the local church to engage in this space and to help people to grow right where they are in their oikos, where they spend most of their life. So we can say profound church development, discipleship, and community transformation can be expected when the work done in these two waves is complementary and based on the same principles. So if in the local church you're working through the NCD principles and trying to develop the environment for healthy growth and celebration, all that sort of stuff. And then on the other side, if we are proactively focusing on helping people in their day-to-day lives and supporting them as they work those principles out right where they are in their oikos, that social unit they simply can't leave. They're always there. The only choice they have is whether they're going to nurture it or let it get sick. So that they're kind of there whether they like it or not. We haven't put them there. They're already there. So how do we meet them in that place and support them through that? And this then, of course, means that the wave flowing out from the local church is getting healthier and creating an environment where people right across society can come and have an opportunity to grow. So a local church is able to then say, what is the minimum factor of the collective oikos of all the people we're connected with, which is not just our members, of course. This is our members plus all the other people they're connected with who are not even part of our local church. So what is that minimum factor? All right, because that's 90% of their lives, that has just become our main celebration and growth focus for the next period of time. This is what we are about. We are a local church because we are meant to be supporting whatever it is that is going on in life, the lives of our people, and the lives of the people they are in close community with beside them. So extremely excited about this development. When I first mentioned it to Christian Schwartz, he was jumping up and down and kind of running around the room, and just very excited because NCD itself grew very much out of Oikos origin. So in a way, we're kind of moving full circle with this. So if we come back to this picture we've had before, in the center of the picture this time, we're talking about the oikos of every person on earth and the ability to walk alongside them right where they are, not asking them, first of all, to come leave anything or come anywhere else, but to say, just right where you are, how can we minister to you? How can we help you grow? How can we celebrate the wins that you're having? How can we help you to make progress in these areas towards life in all its fullness? And the beauty of that is that it follows the model of Jesus, where it's discipleship before decision. The first disciples didn't have to make an ultimate decision about their allegiance to Christ, and their ultimate allegiance right from the beginning. They simply followed. They were able to grow and learn along the way before any decision would necessarily be made. And so this allows us to be able to move into that kind of realm and walk alongside people in exactly that kind of way, meeting them where they're at on a principle basis and helping them grow in exactly the same way that we're growing our own oikos, side by side. No superiority, nothing like this, just standing side by side saying we're still dealing with the same principles in your world and my world. Let's work out how to grow together on that basis. Now, all of this sits against the backdrop of releasing all by itself growth, but rather than just thinking of it in the confines of the local church kind of organization, so to speak, it's all by itself growth everywhere. So we can say NCD is natural church development, and we can also say NCD, the natural all by itself part, is natural character development. We can also say NCD is natural community development. Now, for some of you who don't like things that are a bit forced like this, I can tell you that the recognizing this three versions of NCD actually happened after the terms church, character, and community were determined. So it just happened to be a coincidence that, of course, only works in English as well. But nevertheless, it's a helpful way of thinking about the fact that in all those spaces, we are not trying to make anything happen. We are still about the business of releasing all by itself growth, releasing the potential in our church, releasing the potential in our individual people through the fruit of the Spirit growing in their character and life, releasing the potential of the people who are in our community all the way around to the ends of the earth. And then these three areas interplay with each other, and there's a huge crossflow then that happens, huge opportunities for the local church to say, what's happening in the oikos of the people in our surrounding community? How can we support that to the greatest extent? Because it's exactly the same thing we've always been trying to be on about. But how can we tap into people in that space and really support them? And ideally and hopefully at a given point, they will come to know Christ through that process as they come to understand how his world works. All right, so just got some final thoughts to share with you, just to wrap all of this up. For what it's worth, I have been involved in this work for about 18 years, had a chance to work with many hundreds of churches in Australia and in different countries, and get a privileged position to see from data and lots of other perspectives a fairly big picture of what's going on in the church. And so if I look out from this 20-year point and onwards to the next 10 years and think, okay, what's my major message, and how can I best support what is happening in the church and look into the future. I can look at it from the perspective of these three spheres, and they shape my thinking and will shape pretty much everything I say for the next 10 years. And I can look at what is the hope in a particular local church and what must they do depending on where their hope is. If I start at a baseline point, because there are a lot of churches that are in distress and a lot of churches that are anxious about the situation in the world, a lot of churches anxious about irregular attendance patterns, all sorts of things are causing anxiety amongst many pastors that I connect with here and around the world. And I will say it as strongly as I can, for the survival. If all you're hoping for is survival as a baseline, then the local church must be clear at the very least as to how their minimum factor is organisationally suffocating them, and remove those associated barriers. The principles are well established. There's no serious questioning that you have to engage with these principles if you're actually going to move forward. The questions are all about how do we make that progress. But for any church, I raise the bar now and I say, if you at least want to survive and maintain the church in the future, then there's a bare minimum benchmark there to at least know what your minimum factor is and to make progress with that. But of course, we hope that no one would settle for that particular position. God has so much more for us. So we go, okay, if you're hoping for increasing fruitfulness, fantastic. Then local churches must embrace an achievable, sustainable approach to improving their current discipleship minimum factor. And our hope is that by breaking it down and saying discipleship mainly needs to be about 1/8 of church life, that one part that comes up on the survey that says, hey, here's your minimum factor. What does this mean at a discipleship level? We have to start transforming our people there, because we know that's the main blockage at the moment for them experiencing life in all its fullness, and then for the people around them coming to discover life in all its fullness. So they must move to that level. But if our eyes are set beyond that and we are looking for community transformation, if we're tired of the discussions about political issues and feel like, despite representative democracy having only been in place for a relatively short part of human history, and we want to say, wow, let's dream of the next version of government. Let's look at a complete transformation of the things that churn through our news feeds on a daily basis, and to imagine what it looks like for God's kingdom rule to beautifully and graciously permeate the whole of society. We have to go to this highest level. And local churches must base their celebration and growth activities primarily on what is happening in the lives of their people and each person's oikos. We eternally talk about relevance in the life of the church, but most times those discussions on relevance are about much more trivial issues, maybe musical style or various things like that. If we're genuinely talking about relevance, we have to be having our eyes fixed on the 90% of waking hours that people are not in our church organized activities, where they are in the world, where they are incarnate, where their salt and light, if it grows, is going to have an extraordinary effect. So this is my challenge to you all and to whoever I speak to in the coming days, is that we have to move to these higher levels if we are going to see greater degrees of progress. Any of you that are still alive after this enormous monologue, apart from Melinda's words earlier, I congratulate you. You've done very, very well. This is a mammoth introduction. As I say, I prefer to talk individually over time on these things, and I hope we will have many further discussions really bringing this to a practical level in the days to come. I look forward to talking to all and any of you ahead around these things. But right now, just briefly, I'd love to just open it for any thoughts or questions. I probably won't be able to answer all of them straight away, but I will have a transcript of all of the chat window. And so on that basis, we'll make sure that I get back to you if I don't get to answer it now. So please, if you have a thought, a comment, a question, anything, you'd just like to write that in the chat window now. I will... Okay. Is there an effective way to grow a volunteer base? We've identified areas that we need to develop but struggle to find people who are willing to step up and help gaps. Yeah, good question. Would require a very lengthy answer. But certainly, I guess my spontaneous thought would be um, to look for what are any existing barriers that prevent people from stepping up. Generally, people don't want to live a passive life. So what is it about stepping into ministry involvement that might be a barrier of some sort for them? That's usually the track that I approach with a local church on that basis as a starting point to prepare the ground for that. And then certainly making sure that they're all fitting into things on the basis of their gifts as well. But certainly happy to have a chat with you sometime about that, Adrian, and go much deeper together on that. Can we have a copy of the presentation? Yes, absolutely. The video will be available, and also I will wrap up and make it downloadable for everyone as well. Andrew, churches are better at organisation and discipleship. What's a good resource to learn about discipleship processes? My own bias is certainly towards the three-color tools, I guess, principally because of the specific nature of it. On the basis that at any person, even the moment they come to Christ, there is something of the image of God present in them and other things very much lacking. And so generic discipleship processes generally, in my observation over the years, have a very limited effect. And so really anything that can make it specific, so if the church survey can give some specific focus, and then secondarily, if personal diagnostics, which doesn't have to be formal tests, but at least people who know the questions to ask to sort of elucidate what it is within a person that needs to be developed. Yeah, Clark, is it because people are time poor? I believe so. My general philosophy is everyone has 168 hours in a week, and as leaders, our major challenge is how do we help people to prioritize in different ways. And a big part of this spheres process for me and presentation is to help people to see a bigger picture of what the local church can be, and on that basis to really raise the bar of possibility and in what they're a part of, rather than some little thing they might be a part of for a few hours a week, to say, no, this can be a hub of complete and thorough community transformation at all imaginable levels. Yeah. I see lots of questions. This is wonderful. I'm getting giddy from reading them, but yes, excellent. Yeah, thank you, Gillian. Three Colors Ministry has been a positive influence in church. That's great. Yes, Clark, yes, discipleship again. Yes, something to do with the Great Commission. We've still got to fully latch onto that. John, if possible, if you have any field data on the removing the associated barriers, it would be very helpful. Certainly, please drop me an email, John, on that. Yes, Ralph, I would agree. I would desperately hope that these kind of concepts would become part of pastor training. Yeah, wonderful. Look, thank you for that. Again, I love to be in direct contact, so please email me, send me a message, and as I say, what I'm presenting to you is pretty much the vision and framework for my life in the next period of time, particularly launching this Oikos survey very soon, and developing these other tools. So I would love to keep the conversation going with you all, but for right now, I would love to pray with you all. Jesus, I thank you so much for the extraordinary privilege that you give us to partner with you, to invite us, that you invite us into your redemptive story that reached such a high point on the cross and with your resurrection. And we want to declare our allegiance to you as our liberating King of all creation. And we want to take our lead from you in all of these things. I thank you so much for the people in this meeting. I know well the challenges associated with helping churches and disciples move to a healthier place of greater salt and light, and I know the many sacrifices that many of these people have made. And I thank you for their lives, and I just pray that you will inspire us further and further to dream further about what can happen in our own local congregations, in the churches we're responsible for, perhaps in whole movements in these challenging times. They are challenging times, but your faithfulness and consistency remains the same, and the principles upon which you build your church remain solid. And despite things moving around, we can tether ourselves, we can then tether our people, we can hold to those principles so strongly, and continue to look for how to bring those principles to life more and more. And so we Lord, I'm excited about this next phase, and I do hope that that excitement will spread, and that you will enthuse all those involved in this, and whoever will listen to the recording as well, in this coming time, that great things are yet to happen. And this is not just a rah-rah statement, but it's a statement based on your consistency and what we can see happens when your people are obedient and move in consistent harmony with the way that you do things in heaven, and want to see that as the way on earth. We love you, Jesus, and we pray all this, and we ask all this in your name and for your sake. Amen. Thank you all very much, and I really look forward to connecting with you again soon to get this stuff hitting the ground. God bless you all. Good night.